In the sultry, sweat-drenched dawn of a Colombian morning, the city of Medellin stirred like a restless giant. The year was 1986, and the air was thick with more than just humidity. It was heavy with the scent of fear and the hum of whispers. The city, nestled in the Aburra Valley, was no stranger to violence. But this was different. This was the dawn of a new era, the beginning of a war that would shake the very foundations of the Colombian state. The sun peeked over the Andes, casting long, dancing shadows across the cobblestone streets. The old city, El Centro, was waking up, its veins pulsing with life. Shopkeepers rolled up their metal grills, vendors set up their stalls, and the first buses rumbled through the streets, spewing a cloud of diesel fumes. But there was an undercurrent, a tension that was palpable, like the calm before a storm. In the heart of the city, a grand colonial mansion stood tall and proud, its whitewashed walls and red-tiled roof a stark contrast to the surrounding poverty. This was the Hacienda Nápoles, the palatial home of Pablo Escobar, the most powerful drug lord in the world. The mansion was a symbol of Escobar's power and wealth, a testament to the drug empire he had built from the ground up. It was also a fortress, a sanctuary where Escobar could retreat from the world, surrounded by his family, his men, and his vast collection of exotic animals. As the sun rose higher in the sky, a black Mercedes-Benz pulled out of the gates of the Hacienda Nápoles. The car was a sleek, powerful beast, its windows tinted, its engine a low, menacing growl. Behind the wheel sat Pablo Escobar, his eyes hidden behind a pair of dark sunglasses. Beside him sat his right-hand man, Carlos Leder, a German-born Colombian who was as ruthless as he was loyal. In the back seat, two heavily armed bodyguards sat in silence, their eyes scanning the streets for any sign of danger. Escobar was a man on a mission. He was going to war not with another drug cartel but with the Colombian state itself. He had been elected to Congress in 1982, a move that had given him a degree of legitimacy and protection from the law. But the government had other plans. They were determined to extradite him to the United States to stand trial for his crimes, a fate that Escobar was determined to avoid at any cost. As the Mercedes wound its way through the streets of Medellin, Escobar's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He thought of his family, of his wife, Maria Victoria Henao, and their two young children, Juan Pablo and Manuela. He thought of the empire he had built, of the millions of dollars he had made, and of the power he wielded. He thought of the war that was coming, of the blood that would be spilled, and of the lives that would be lost. But most of all, he thought of the Colombian state, of the politicians and the judges and the police who dared to defy him. He would not go quietly into the night. He would not vanish without a fight. He would make them pay. The Mercedes pulled up outside a nondescript building in the heart of Medellin. Escobar and Leder got out of the car, their bodyguards close behind. They walked into the building, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Inside, a group of men were waiting for them, their faces grim, their eyes filled with determination. They were the leaders of the other drug cartels, the Ochoa brothers, the Rodriguez-Orihuela brothers, and the Galeano brothers. They had come to Medellin to meet with Escobar, to forge an alliance, to stand together against the Colombian state. As Escobar took his seat at the head of the table, he looked around at the faces of the men who would stand with him in the coming war. He felt a sense of pride, of power, of invincibility. He was Pablo Escobar, the king of cocaine, the most powerful man in Colombia. He would not be extradited. He would not be defeated. He would fight and he would win. But as Escobar looked around the table, he also felt a sense of unease. He knew that the road ahead would be long and bloody. He knew that there would be sacrifices, that there would be losses. He knew that the Colombian state would not go down without a fight. But he also knew that he had no choice. He had to fight. He had to win. For himself, for his family, for his empire, for his legacy. As the meeting began, the men around the table leaned in, their voices low, their words measured. The war had begun. The war against the Colombian state had begun. And there was no turning back. But as the men spoke, the door to the room suddenly burst open. A man stumbled in, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. He was one of Escobar's men, a lookout, a sentry. He had come to warn them, to tell them that the police were on their way. They had been betrayed. They had been set up. In an instant, the room erupted into chaos. Chairs were thrown back, men drew their guns, and the sound of shouting filled the air. Escobar and Letter exchanged a glance, a silent communication passing between them. They had to get out. They had to escape. They had to survive. As Escobar and Letter made their way to the door, they could hear the sound of sirens in the distance, the wail of the police cars as they closed in. They ran down the stairs, their hearts pounding in their chests, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. They burst out onto the street, their guns drawn, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the police. But it was too late. The police were already there, their cars blocking the street, their guns trained on Escobar and Letter. They were surrounded. They were trapped. They were outnumbered and outgunned. Escobar and Letter exchanged a glance, a silent communication passing between them. They had to fight. They had to survive. They had to win. But as the police closed in, as the sound of gunfire filled the air, Escobar knew that this was just the beginning. This was just the first skirmish in a war that would consume them all. This was just the start of the end. And as the sun set over Medellin, as the city was bathed in the red glow of the dying light, Pablo Escobar knew that he was at war. He was at war with the Colombian state, and there was no turning back. The war had begun, and it would not end until one side was defeated, until one side was left standing. And as Escobar raised his gun, as he prepared to fight, he knew that he would not go down without a fight. He would not go down without a war. As the first shots rang out, Escobar and Letter dove for cover, their bodies hitting the ground with a jarring thud. The street erupted into a cacophony of gunfire, the sound of bullets ricocheting off the pavement, the shattering of glass as car windows were blown out. Escobar's men, caught off guard, scrambled to return fire, their movements chaotic, their aim wild. The police, better prepared, advanced in a tight formation, their shields raised, their guns spitting death. Escobar, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps, knew they had to get out. They had to break through the police line to escape, to survive. He looked over at Letter, who was crouched behind a car, his gun blazing. Their eyes met, and in that moment, they understood each other. They had to work together. They had to fight their way out. Escobar grabbed a grenade from his belt, pulled the pin, and threw it towards the advancing police line. The explosion was deafening, the force of it sending men flying, their bodies twisted and broken. The police line faltered, their advance slowed. Escobar and Letter seized the opportunity, their guns blazing as they ran towards the gap in the police line. They burst through, their bodies low to the ground, their guns spitting fire. They ran down the street, their hearts pounding, their lungs burning. They could hear the sound of sirens behind them, the wail of police cars as they gave chase. They turned a corner, then another, their bodies fueled by adrenaline, their minds focused on one thing: escape. They ran through the narrow alleys of Medellin, their footsteps echoing off the walls, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. They could hear the sound of helicopters above them, the thump-thump-thump of their rotors as they searched for them from the sky. They knew they had to get off the streets, to find a place to hide, to regroup. They burst into a small, run-down apartment building, their guns drawn, their eyes scanning the darkness. They could hear the sound of footsteps behind them, the shouts of the police as they closed in. They ran up the stairs, their bodies fueled by adrenaline, their minds focused on one thing: survival. They burst into an apartment at the top of the building, their guns trained on the darkness. The apartment was empty, the furniture old and worn. They could hear the sound of the police below, their footsteps echoing up the stairs. They knew they had to act fast. They had to set a trap. Escobar grabbed a can of gasoline from the kitchen, poured it over the furniture, the curtains, the floor. Letter grabbed a lighter from the counter, his hands steady, his eyes focused. He flicked the lighter, the flame dancing to life. He tossed it onto the gasoline-soaked floor, and the apartment erupted into flames. The sound of the fire was deafening, the heat intense. They could hear the shouts of the police below, their footsteps retreating as they realized what was happening. They waited, their bodies crouched, their guns ready. They knew the police would come. They knew they would try to save the people in the building. And when they did, Escobar and Letter would be ready. The first police officer burst into the apartment, his gun drawn, his face covered in soot. Escobar and Letter opened fire, their guns spitting death. The officer fell, his body hitting the floor with a thud. More officers followed, their guns blazing, their bodies silhouetted against the flames. Escobar and Letter fought back, their guns blazing, their bodies fueled by adrenaline, their minds focused on one thing: survival. As the last officer fell, Escobar and Letter knew they had to go. They had to get out of the building, to find a safe place to regroup, to plan their next move. They ran down the stairs, their bodies low to the ground, their guns ready. They burst out onto the street, the sound of sirens filling the air, the smell of smoke thick in their nostrils. They ran through the streets of Medellin, their bodies fueled by adrenaline, their minds focused on one thing: escape. They knew they had to get out of the city, to find a safe place to hide, to plan their next move. They knew they had to regroup, to rebuild, to fight back. They made their way to a safe house on the outskirts of the city, a small, nondescript building hidden among the trees. They slipped inside, their bodies exhausted, their minds racing. They knew they had to act fast. They knew they had to strike back. They knew they had to win this war. As they sat in the safe house, their bodies battered and bruised, their minds focused on one thing: revenge. Escobar knew that this was just the beginning. This was just the first skirmish in a war that would consume them all. This was just the start of the end. He looked over at Letter, who was sitting on the couch, his head in his hands, his body shaking with exhaustion. Escobar knew that Letter was strong, that he was a fighter, but he also knew that Letter was not invincible. He knew that Letter had his limits, that he had his weaknesses, and he knew that he had to use that to his advantage. He walked over to Letter, his footsteps soft on the wooden floor. He put a hand on Letter's shoulder, his grip firm, his voice steady. "We will win this war, Carlos," he said, his voice low, his eyes burning with intensity. "We will fight and we will win. We will not go down without a fight. We will not go down without a war." Letter looked up at Escobar, his eyes meeting his expression determined. "Yes, Pablo," he said, his voice steady, his resolve unwavering. "We will fight. We will win. We will not go down without a fight. We will not go down without a war." As Escobar and Letter sat in the safe house, their bodies battered and bruised, their minds focused on one thing: revenge. They knew that the road ahead would be long and bloody. They knew that there would be sacrifices, that there would be losses. They knew that the Colombian state would not go down without a fight. But they also knew that they had no choice. They had to fight. They had to win. For themselves, for their family, for their empire, for their legacy. And as Escobar and Letter sat in the safe house, their bodies battered and bruised, their minds focused on one thing: revenge, they knew that the war had only just begun. They knew that the Colombian state would not rest, that they would not give up. They knew that they would have to fight, that they would have to win. They knew that they would have to do whatever it took to survive. But as Escobar and Letter sat in the safe house, their bodies battered and bruised, their minds focused on one thing: revenge, they also knew that they were not alone. They had an army at their back, a vast network of men and women who would stand with them, who would fight with them, who would die with them. They had the power of their empire, the wealth of their cocaine trade, the strength of their will. And they knew that, with those things, they could not be defeated. They could not be stopped. They could not be broken. As Escobar and Letter sat in the safe house, their bodies battered and bruised, their minds focused on one thing: revenge, they knew that the war had only just begun. They knew that the road ahead would be long and bloody. They knew that there would be sacrifices, that there would be losses. But they also knew that they had no choice. They had to fight. They had to win. For themselves, for their family, for their empire, for their legacy. And as Escobar and Letter sat in the safe house, their bodies battered and bruised, their minds focused on one thing: revenge, they knew that they would not go down without a fight. They would not go down without a war. They would fight and they would win. They would survive. They would rise. They would conquer. They would be victorious. They would be invincible. They would be unstoppable. They would be the kings of Medellin. They would be the kings of Colombia. They would be the kings of the world. In the heart of Medellin, the air was thick with tension and the stench of cordite. The city, once a vibrant tapestry of life, was now a battlefield, a symphony of gunfire and explosions. Escobar and Letter, their faces etched with determination, watched from the balcony of their safe house as their army clashed with the Colombian National Police. The war had reached its zenith, a crescendo of violence that had been building for years. The pivotal moment came when a police helicopter, a metallic dragon breathing fire, swooped low over the rooftops. It was a daring move, a suicide mission, as it drew the wrath of Escobar's anti-aircraft guns. But the pilot was fearless, his resolve unshakable. He banked sharply, avoiding the hail of bullets, and unleashed a barrage of rockets onto the safe house. The explosion was deafening, a thunderclap that shook the very foundations of the city. The building groaned, its walls crumbling like sandcastles at high tide. Escobar and Letter were thrown to the ground, their bodies battered and bruised, their minds reeling. They emerged from the rubble, coughing and bloodied, but alive. They looked at each other, their eyes reflecting the inferno that raged around them. They knew that this was it, the moment of truth. They could either run, disappear into the night, or they could stand and fight, their backs against the wall, their guns blazing. They chose the latter. With a roar that echoed the primal scream of the city, they charged into the fray, their weapons spitting death. They fought like men possessed, their bodies fueled by adrenaline, their minds driven by a singular purpose. They were not just fighting for their lives, they were fighting for their legacy, for their empire, for their family. They were fighting for Medellin, for Colombia. They were fighting for their right to exist, to rule, to be the kings of the underworld. The battle raged on, a bloody ballet of violence and desperation. The police, despite their courage, were no match for the sheer ferocity of Escobar's men. One by one, they fell, their bodies littering the streets like broken dolls. The safe house was a smoldering ruin, a testament to the power of the explosion, a symbol of the war that had ravaged the city. As the dust settled, Escobar and Letter stood victorious, their bodies battered, their spirits unbroken. They looked out over the carnage, their eyes reflecting the devastation, the loss, the triumph. They had won, but at a terrible cost. The war was over, but the aftermath was just beginning. The resolution of the central tension came not with a bang, but with a whisper. Escobar, his voice hoarse from shouting orders, turned to Letter. "It's over," he said, his eyes reflecting the first glimmer of peace he had felt in years. "We've won." Letter nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "We did it, Pablo. We did what no one else could. We fought and we won." But victory was a bitter pill to swallow. The war had left Medellin in ruins, its streets stained with blood, its people haunted by the echoes of violence. The Colombian state, though weakened, was not defeated. They would regroup, they would rebuild, they would come back stronger. Escobar and Letter knew this, and they knew that their days were numbered. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The aftermath was a grim affair. The bodies were counted, the wounded were tended to, the survivors were mourned. The safe house was abandoned, its walls a silent testament to the violence that had unfolded within. Escobar and Letter, their bodies battered, their minds weary, retreated to the shadows, their empire crumbling around them. In the quiet moments between the chaos, Escobar found himself reflecting on the path that had led him here. He thought of the boy he had been, the dreams he had dreamt, the promises he had made. He thought of the man he had become, the empire he had built, the lives he had taken, the lives he had lost. He thought of the war that had consumed him, the violence that had defined him, the legacy that he would leave behind. And in that moment of reflection, he realized the truth. The war was not about power or money or territory. It was about identity, about belonging, about leaving a mark on the world. It was about being remembered, about being feared, about being respected. It was about being a king, a god, a legend. It was about being Pablo Escobar. But as he looked out over the ruins of Medellin, he also realized the cost of that identity. The war had taken everything from him, everything except his life. And even that, he knew, was on borrowed time. He had won the battle, but the war was far from over. And in the end, he would lose everything. His empire, his family, his freedom, his life. He would lose it all because that was the price of being Pablo Escobar. And so, as the sun set over Medellin, casting a crimson glow over the smoldering ruins, Pablo Escobar stood alone. His body battered, his mind weary, his heart heavy. He looked out over the city, his city, and he wondered what would remain when he was gone. Would they remember him as a king, a god, a legend? Or would they remember him as a monster, a criminal, a murderer? Would they remember him at all? And as the last light faded, casting the city into darkness, Pablo Escobar turned away, his eyes reflecting the first glimmer of fear he had felt in years. For he knew that the war was not over, that the Colombian state would not rest, that they would come for him, that they would take everything from him. And he knew that, in the end, he would lose. He would lose it all. And he would be nothing. Nothing but a memory, a whisper, a ghost in the machine. And he would be forgotten. And that, he realized, was the greatest fear of all.